Hey, thank you so much for joining us for another episode. I am so grateful for all of you that continue to listen and binge listen to the Divorce Conversations for Women podcast. I am always looking for interesting topics and great guests. And I am so excited to be able to have a conversation with Lauren Hunt. She is an attorney out of New York State. She's also a trained mediator. And today we're going to be talking about co-parenting tips, and also co-parenting with maybe some high conflict situations and some additional things that people might want to consider. So, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me, though.
So where do we even want to start, right? I know that
Sure.
there's people that are listening that, one of their biggest concerns, right along there with the financial aspect is the parenting aspect for the kids. And I love that you focus on healthy communication because, I think there's a lot of power in having
hmm
good communication tactics. My undergraduate degree is in communication, so I'm all about like, how do we set those healthy boundaries and have assertive conversations and stuff like that.
hmm
So, talk to me a little bit about, so before we dive into some of the practical tips, share with us a little bit about what are you seeing, on a day-to-day basis? What are some of the trends that you're seeing or the challenges that you're experiencing for the people that you're working with?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that I see a lot now is that well, at least in New York State, when I first started practicing, we still had a lot of custody arrangements where one person had primary physical custody and then the other person had parenting time. And in the last like 5 to 7 years, I've seen this large shift towards equal parenting time. And I don't think there's anything necessarily anything wrong with that, right? I think that to some extent there it can be very beneficial in a lot of relationships. But when you get into those relationships where there is issues with power and control and where there is like more high conflict, it's definitely an area that creates the request for a 50-50. When one person doesn't want it, it just creates even more conflict that then once the divorce is finally done, whatever the custody arrangement is, like that conflict just sort of creates, it's not a good starting spot, right? Like when you're entering into a marriage, you're entering in with you want all the good stuff to happen, right? Same thing when you're entering into divorce because you're now changing your relationship and you want to try and change that relationship and lead some good groundwork. When you have a high conflict parent on the other side, it's even harder when that change in the relationship is one that's already fraught with tension, difficulty, and anger to some extent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and it's interesting that you brought up the trend that you've seen over the last, 5 to 7 years, because this is something, and I want to just take a moment and just kind of like unpack this a little bit. So, again, my area of expertise is the financial area. However, a
Mhm.
lot of the different areas within the process kind of, overspill into the financial.
Mhm.
And one of course is, the child support, which
Mhm.
again, when we're trying to figure out the financials, that can often be a big component
Mhm.
to it.
Mhm.
I don't disagree that there has been this shift and push for 50-50. Talk to us a little bit about though, because I'm familiar with some research. There's a lot of organizations out there that are advocating that 50-50 may, and I just pulled up an article before we hopped on because I'm always trying to like, I'm always reading articles and, it's what we
Yeah.
do, right?
Right.
Um, and they were talking about how, there is a case study, several case studies, right, that are showing that if 50-50 may not be in the kid's best interest if there is abuse
Mhm.
or things like that. So can we clarify a little bit maybe and talk a little bit about this trend that you're seeing?
Yeah. So it's so interesting, right? The judges that I tend to appear before, they in New York State, our statute is pretty vague for custody. It just basically says, best interest of the child, right? And the case law defines what best interest is. And the only factor that because best interests analysis in New York State is a factor-based test. So every single case is different as to what's best for those kids. Um, and the only factor that is in the statute is that the courts need to consider the effect of domestic violence on the children, right? And so when that came into being, those of us, my background is in working with victims of domestic violence. I started at a legal services corporate organization where I represented victims of domestic violence. So that's my background. I now represent, a variety of people, but that's where I started. And when that factor was specifically listed in the statute, it was like, wow, this is great. But where that factor what that has sort of evolved into is judges saying, well, I understand that there might be DV between the two parents, and maybe even the kids witnessed some of it. But unless you can show me that there's been an impact on the direct impact on the children of the DV, I'm going to assume that now that the parents are physically separated, that DV is not going to be present, or it's going to be so less, and it's not going to impact the kids. And that's not really what we're seeing in practice. So this great idea of sort of like, oh, it's going to be kumbaya, right? We're going to separate them, put them into different houses, and what was happening before is not going to happen. It either trickles down to the kids, right? Because if mom or dad wasn't whoever received was the victim of the violence, right? If that person isn't there and it was physical violence, it's very possible that the kids might be the recipient of that, right? But if it's emotional or mental abuse, then the kids, they're not free from that level of manipulation, and that's the harder one almost. Because if kids come in your house and they've got bruises, you know, there's something you could sort of start to pin on, but you can't track down mental abuse as easily. Manipulation is a totally different type of abuse.
Yeah.
It's much harder to prove. So for me, it's very hard to see this trend because coming from where my background is, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. I mean, I love that you have, that background, because here's the thing, right? There's plenty of study, including the ACE study, right? Very well-known report and research that's research-based, right? That is showing the impact of domestic violence on children.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody that is either in that position or has been in that position in the past knows that it is going to impact the people around them,
Mm-hmm.
and to what
Mm-hmm.
degree. And so I think there's this misperception sometimes, like, hey, it's better for the kids to be with both parents no matter what is going on in
Mm-hmm.
those individual households. And it's like, that works and sounds great if you have two healthy, reasonable, respective parents, right, that are respecting each other. But when we've got these other issues going on, it's really tricky. And I agree, like, we could even add to the emotional, psychological, and financial abuse, which is a whole nother conversation where they're
Mm-hmm.
using money to control, you know,
Mm-hmm.
their intimate partner and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it is harder to control, or harder to prove,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
It's really frustrating. And but what's even harder is that when people go to divorce, typically tensions are higher, right? I absolutely have those cases where they're very amicable, things just aren't working out, and hey, we're going to go our separate ways. That situation, most of the time 50-50 is great, right?
Mhm.
Especially if the parents are living close together. But you then have that situation where maybe the last couple of years has really been like a downhill trend, right? And as the relationship has gone downhill, the imbalance of power and control has gone up, right? Those situations are really, really hard. And I have people that they come meet with me, and I have to be honest with them. I view my job is, I don't do you a service if I sugarcoat everything, right? So if you meet with me, you might not get the answers you like, but you're going to get the answers based upon what I'm seeing happening right now, you know? And I think a lot of parents get nervous, right? Like, well, what the heck is going to happen to me if I move forward with this divorce, right? Because it's this black hole that I talk about a lot. You don't know the future, right? Um, but I do think that even when there is an arrangement where there's 50-50, um, even if you don't like it, um, a lot of the times, once some of this initial break has happened and kids get settled into a schedule, where there might have been, you know, a right before the divorce, like this short lead up where the balance of power and control got out of balance in the relationship, I see that kind of come back into check. And then there's those other relationships where it's been long standing. Those are the ones where it's like, okay, yeah, this is going to be a long standing problem for you.
Yeah.
And those parents have got a road ahead of them, but there's definitely tips and tools that they can use to try and make it a little bit easier, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, and I think, I have seen, and I don't know how this runs in New York, but like in those types of situations where, let's be honest, when the divorce process is done, right? Your role has concluded. My role has essentially concluded. I mean, I do an offboarding and make sure they get pointed in the right
Mhm.
direction. But at that point, then, I say, hey, you've got your post-divorce team, and they'll be able to help you with that. And I think that that's, important, but it's like, okay, who's going to be that? Is there going to be a person? Is it you know, an arbitrator? Is
Mhm.
it a mediator? Is it a
Mhm.
parenting coordinator
Mhm.
or a parenting specialist? Can you guys identify somebody that could be kind of that go-to named person that can be the point person if there are issues on the parenting side after the divorce is over? And I'm curious if you've ever utilized any of those strategies.
Yeah, so in New York State, we don't use parenting coordinators, and I don't know why. I'll be honest, I have no idea why, but I think it's one of the biggest problems that we have because custody should just never it unless it is a truly, there's there a judge has to get involved. A judge just should not be deciding the mundane issues that come up when you have a really high conflict co-parent, right? Because it could be every single day you have a conflict. Um, and so to me, I think if we had parenting coordinators in New York State, it would be a great idea. Be great, great help. But that would be one of the places that that if we had them, I would send people. So what we typically suggest, or at least what I typically suggest in New York State, is establishing maybe co-parent counseling to see if the counselor can help work through these issues, lay a better foundation for communication. If that isn't an option, certainly you can have a mediator who's kind of like not necessarily on call, but they're familiar with your family. That's the person you go to when you truly have reached an impasse. Um, but yeah, those are really the initial two. If you've made all the attempts you can and you're not making any headway, those are really where I send people is first try co-parenting counseling. And if that doesn't work, or if that sounds completely distasteful, then try mediation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think it's having a plan, to set yourself up for success, that if you do need, these additional support aspects, that they're in place to do that. Because I mean, I think otherwise it's like, I don't know, if we don't talk about it and there isn't kind of a plan, hey, you plan for some of these challenges, and hey, hopefully you don't need them, right? Hopefully you don't
Mhm.
even need to ever call to do any official, co-parent counseling or whatever. But that way, then if you need it, you both of you have a plan, right? You've already
Mhm.
agreed to, what that's going to look like. And I think that
Mhm.
certainly seems helpful. So let's, switch gears a little bit and talk about, okay, so for the women that are listening that are like, okay, this is, yes, I'm hearing what you're saying. Yes, I'm, feeling still a little bit unsettled around this conversation. What are some practical things that people could be doing, particularly around the communication? And if there's anything else that you want to add, that would be
Mhm.
great. But what are some things that people can do? Because I'm all about like practical.
Right. No. And so I think, you know, we're looking at this in the sense of somebody who's potentially going to file or pursue a separation, right? And then maybe those people who are still early on. But quite frankly, these tips apply to anybody. So I think the main thing you've got to consider is that a co-parenting relationship is not a parenting relationship. They are totally different. So when I say parenting relationship, I mean you two are living together, you are tag teaming to whatever extent that might have been in your relationship, right? Like sometimes tag teaming means one parent's doing all the work, but you're together, right? And you're parenting to quote unquote parenting together. Co-parenting is you're parenting apart, right? And yes, you still have to come together on the big topics or logistics that require each other's work or involvement. But you are parenting apart. They're very different. They are very different relationships. And when you're co-parenting or parenting apart, it's a business relationship, so what inherently that means is you need to do everything you can on your side of the equation to take out that emotion that maybe used to be there when you were parenting together, right? Or to take out that level of, okay, listen, maybe I'm just going to overlook this piece, right? You need to figure out what are your biggest goals for your kids. And that's what you're hammering on when you're looking at the business relationship. So literally, I think that this comes down to thinking about, let's say that there's a conflict that you're having with your co-parent. And let's just use an example. You want to register the children for a summer camp and your ex wants to do a different summer camp, right? Like, let's just put it into an example. I think rather than sending 17 million emails,
because we don't ever do that when we're like feeling overwhelmed or anxious, right?
Right, exactly. Rather than sending 17 million emails with each email being 5 pages, single space, set a time that you two are going to talk together and make it a business meeting. Maybe even set an agenda, say, let's meet from this time to this time, and create the air of, we're taking it out of email, we're putting it into discussion. After that business meeting, send a summary. This is what I understood your position to be. This is what I understood this was my position. Here's any resolutions we've reached. Before you send out that summary, look through it. Is there anything in here where I'm being passive aggressive, right? Or is there anything in here where I'm putting a little extra in that doesn't need to be there, right? Because we're all guilty of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all are. And so when I say it's a business relationship, you are responsible for everything on your side of the V. Remove every bit of emotion that you can. The other side, they may bring all of the emotion to the table, but let that be on them. Because let me tell you, if this argument or this issue about summer camp, right, in our example, goes to a judge, you always want it to be that the fingers are pointing towards the other side, right? You clearly in all of your communications remain cool, calm, collected, to the point. It's the other side that was throwing all the daggers, right? The other thing when you're talking about a business relationship is thinking about, how can I strip this down to exactly what I need to communicate? And so for the summer camp issue, right? Go in knowing your goal, right? I want X summer camp, but if I can't have X summer camp, I'm okay with their summer camp so long as transportation is handled by them, right? Whatever it might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So go in with not just your goal, but is there some bridge that you could use to get a compromise, right? Because it's rare that they're going to, if you're already at an impasse, it's rare you're going to get everything you're asking for, right? So enter into that conversation with, okay, well, where can I compromise? Where's my leverage? I know that if I gave them their summer camp, they would love that. But what's the problem for me if I strip it down? Is it really the summer camp or is it the transportation issue? And
I love this. Okay, so can I build on this for just a second?
yeah.
I have 2 thoughts. So one is, this is great, right? When we're thinking about negotiating and boundaries, this is essentially what's happening, right? And I love this example. And so one of the things that I would often encourage my clients to do is say, okay, what are you willing to do? And what are you able to do? And it's not or, it's and. What am I able and what am I willing? So I love this example of the summer camps. Am I able to take our child or children to the summer camp? If the answer is no, and it for whatever reason is during something else, you already have a commitment or you're working or it's logistically not going to happen, the answer is no. You might be willing, hey, I would be totally willing to take them, but I logistically can't. And on the flip side, right, maybe you're logistically able to take them, but for whatever reason, you don't want to. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but you have a choice. Maybe it's a camp that you don't agree with, or philosophically you have challenge. So yes, I'm able to take them. I'm not necessarily willing to take them. Can we look at maybe this instead?
Exactly. And so obviously the finances sometimes tie into it, right?
Yes.
I had a very long standing argument. Summer camp is silly to argue about, right? That's what we think, but it happens. And I had a case a little while ago where the other side, for whatever reason, was dead set on sending the kids to a specific summer camp, which was way more than what my client could afford for her share of the camp. And there was a ton of back and forth, right? Attorneys got involved. And I kept saying to my client, like, listen, you're paying now for me to argue this issue, right? How much do you want to spend for me versus how much do you want to spend on the summer camp? Or how much would you spend on the summer camp versus spending it on me? Right. So you really have to just sort of like what you were boiled it down, what you said, you have to boil it down to like, what am I willing and what am I able? Right. She just didn't, to some extent, people just don't want to agree. And that's okay. But you've got to recognize when you're like, I'm just being difficult just to be difficult. Right. Because
Yeah.
and I don't know about you, but sometimes I come to a conversation and I kind of got my back up, right? Sometimes you need to pause and be like, okay, wait a minute here. Am I just being difficult? Is there some bridge I can use? And a lot of the times it helps you get through an impasse.
Yeah.
So, but you're not going to get to that bridge if you're coming to the conversation charged with emotion, right?
Yeah. No, for sure.
And that's the key is like when you're transferring this into a business relationship, you need to remove that emotion.
And I love the financial aspect of this thing too, because again, summer camps, variable expenses. How are we going to handle it?
Mhm.
Right. And so a lot of times what I'll see or encourage my clients to ask for is, hey, can we have a cap on certain expenses? So like, for example, it's whatever, doesn't matter the dollar amount, but let's just say it was $200 and the camp, is 1,000. It's like, hey, listen, unless I agree to the 500, the cap's 200. And so if one party goes and signs them up for this $1,000 summer camp and then comes back and says, oh, hey, by the way, you owe me 500 because it's like, actually, no, we had agreed that there was a boundary on that. The other thing is, I don't know if do you have any apps? Like, I think, when we talk about the business relationship of these types of conversations around co-parenting, there are some really great apps out there that I think take the emotion out of it as well, because we have then a third party who's essentially, right, kind of helping with that. Are there any apps that you typically recommend related to that?
So for co-parenting apps, I think all of them are quite frankly pretty good. Most of my clients, if they are in a high conflict relationship, they do use Our Family Wizard, but that's by no means like the only app or the best app, right?
Yeah.
They are all very good because they force it into a much more business relationship,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it forces you to, well, in theory, it forces you to take a second before you send that message, right? Because most of them have like tone meters where if you're sending multiple emails or multiple messages through the app, they'll say a little like warning sign will pop up, right? You just sent 7 messages. Do you really need to send the 8th, right? I know specifically Our Family Wizard has that type of thing. So it just forces you to take a pause.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, especially when we're in a co-parenting relationship and we're looking at it from the same lens as a parenting relationship, we're thinking about, oh, well, I'm just going to send a quick text to them that they've got to go pick up Jack from daycare because I can't, right? Because that's what would happen when you're parenting together.
That's right.
Right? It's different when you're parenting apart because you're not able to really, I'm not saying I order my husband to go pick up our son, but like, hey, pick up Jack because I'm running late, right? It happens. And then something like that, if you send a text like that and you're in a high conflict relationship, what might be normal in a regular parenting relationship, if you send that in a high conflict relationship, it can spur then a chain of text messages, right? And so it's tough because obviously you need to be able to work and get things done for your kids, but you need to have the ability to pause and quickly think, is there a way I can approach this communication in a way that's going to be received best? Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes the text message has to be sent. Other times it's a very short email to them saying, hey, we clearly have a difference on this topic. Let's sit down, talk about it. Here's the agenda.
Yeah.
Does this day work for you? Let me know by this time if this works.
Yep. No, absolutely. And, and I think Our Family Wizard on the app side, I mean, if there needs to be this kind of tracking or, essentially like a record of the communication, I think it's super helpful. There's 2 other ones that I have run across that people may just want to check out. And you might want to check out as well. So the one is Fayr, Fayr.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Co-parenting app, right? I like it because it has a date time and stamp for drop off and
Mhm.
the kind of that piece of it. And then from on the financial side, there's an app called Decomply. And
Mhm.
Decomply is really not on the communication side, it's really focused on the financials. I love it because it's simple, it's easy. There's this internal Venmo feature, and it specializes in the financial aspect on the variable expense side, where sometimes, again, our Family Wizard has grown and expanded and added on different modules and stuff like that. And if people are already using our Family Wizard, then I think that can certainly be a great option. But if they're not, they might want to check out some of these other ones as well that also have gotten really great reviews. I know the developers for both of them, as I'm sure you probably do too, and they're just really good. And it's a matter of finding an app that's going to work for you. You know what I mean? Like it takes some of I think the anxiety out of those transactions.
Yeah, and I think to some extent it makes it again more of a business relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it pulls
Mm-hmm.
it away from your text messages, which it's so quick to respond, right? And it forces you into, okay, I've got to open up the app, I've got to look. It forces you to slow down.
Yeah.
And it also allows you the opportunity to say, okay, listen, this isn't getting pushed through to my phone, right? You have the ability to set your push notifications.
Yep.
So I'm going to decide 9 o'clock after the kids are in bed, 9 o'clock at night is when I go in and deal with my co-parenting things, right? So just like sometimes people time block their schedules, right, for working, you can time block your co-parenting. And
Yep.
it's just every little bit that you can to create boundaries in that mimic a business relationship is key,
Yeah.
you
Yeah. I
know?
love that. I love that. And I think, again, there's so many great tools,
Mhm.
right? And resources, available for people to be able to do that.
Mhm.
But I also feel like they might be building that muscle, right? The communication muscle that, might have experienced some breakdown even while they were parenting together, right? That now they have an opportunity to kind of revisit. So, okay, what else? What are some other suggestions?
Yeah. So, you know, one other suggestion that I have is to always, if you are working with an attorney, ask your attorney. If you're working with an attorney and there's a lot of conflict on the custodial matters, okay, ask your attorney, what do you reasonably think is going to happen here? Right? You've hired your attorney for their expertise, for understanding maybe the judges, maybe the opposing parties, opposing counsel. You know, certainly we don't have crystal balls. We can't predict what is going to happen in any sort of situation, but we kind of have a sense as to, these are the ranges, these are the worlds we're operating within. You know, you want to know from your attorney if you are asking, for example, to have the kids, half of the summer, is this reason something that they could reasonably see happen in your fact pattern? Does your attorney think that a judge might reasonably issue that decision? Is there a basis to get it from opposing counsel, right? Because if you're turning over your hard-earned dollars, right, finances, right,
Hmm.
you're turning over your money, you want to make sure that there's some potential that you're going to recoup it. Because I have seen so many times where over and over people come to me for a second opinion, right? And they're like, I've been asking for this and asking for this and asking for this. I'm spending so much money. And as I'm going through this consult, this second opinion with them, it's quickly become apparent their attorney never did a cost benefit analysis with them,
Hmm.
you know? And so they don't realize that what they're asking for is basically Mars, right? And is hard to get exactly what they're asking for, but maybe with a few tweaks, you could get at least somewhat close. So you always need to be engaging in a cost benefit analysis and asking your attorney to help you with that, right? Because as a client, you don't know what's reasonable.
Yeah.
You might know what's reasonable, right? But you don't know what typically could result. And that's where your attorney's expertise is coming in. And if your attorney is not doing a cost benefit analysis with you, then that's a whole nother topic for another day.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I really think that a lot of times when it's a high conflict relationship, people can get so caught into the fighting that they lose the focus. And it's you need to try your best to stay out of the fighting as much as possible and to keep your attorney focused with you on, like, okay, here are our main goals. We think that these are achievable, and the cost to achieve them is going to be worth it long term.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's really great. I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, those are the kinds of conversations that need to be happening. And if I'm reading between the lines, this is very much like in alignment with a lot of the things that I feel like need to happen, which is, okay, here's your best case scenario. Here's your worst case scenario. How do we, meaning, client partnering with the attorney, right? And me as part of the team, how do we move the needle closer to the best case scenario, right? Not off the charts, unreasonable, but within the reasonable range. How do we just not accept, the worst case scenario? How do we move and I'm always like, how do we move the needle? If we move the needle from where it would have been, I feel like that's a win.
100%. Exactly. And I think, again, just sometimes people, and it's natural, you get stuck into your arguments, right? Because there's so much tension, there's so much emotion in that relationship that you're like, no, I want to win, right? People come to me and they're like, I can't let them win. And I'm like, listen, in a custody case, there's no winning, right? This is what makes sense for this family, or sometimes this is what the judge says makes sense.
Yeah.
But you've got to keep a cost benefit analysis in place the entire time.
Yeah.
And it's tough in custody because it's not like on child support, for example, right? You know that, okay, well, we're arguing over $200 every month for the next 3 months or for the next 3 years. There's a number, right? You know what that costs and whether it's going to cost more or less for your attorney to argue for that additional $200 for the next 3 years, right? It's harder to place a cost on custody. And I think that's where people get a bit led astray is they're like, well, there's no way I can put a cost on this. And it's like, well, yeah, you can, right? Because there's a cost to whether or not you want to add this drama to your life for the one summer of summer camp that you two are arguing about, right? So there's a lot of different costs. They're not dollars, but they're costs. And I think they're overlooked too frequently in custody.
I think that's a really good point because you're right. Like if we're talking about the emotional aspect of it, right? And again, we got to weigh it out. Not every situation is black and white. Not one is always going to be, not everyone is exactly the same. But yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And I think that our emotional tank, if you will, is certainly something to consider. I know it's something that, I have a conversation with my clients about, but a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, right, when we're doing the cost benefit analysis, I feel like it is a little bit easier. If we're talking about, okay, should you hire a forensic accountant or a business valuation expert? We can get a quote, we can have an initial conversation, we can identify if we think there's enough assets there that would warrant that, and we can take it in phases. The work that you're doing on that side of the custody and parenting time, you're right. I mean, unless we're looking at child support, that's really kind of the key financial factor, but the emotional aspects are greater.
Yeah. And you have to think about, the longer the custody case goes on, right, the closer you potentially get to trial. A trial means you're getting up on the stand and you're both saying what's terrible about the other parent. It's really hard to come back from that, right? So that's not to say that it's just you cave and agree to what the other side says, but it is a sense of like, okay, now let's again go back to where is that bridge? Is there another, are there other things that I can pull, other levers I can pull to get us to some level where I can be okay with it? It's not exactly what I want, but I can be okay with it, And I just think some people shortchange that cost benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll be honest too, Lauren. I feel like, with your background and you've got the domestic violence aspect. So you have training and awareness there. The mediation piece, which is all about negotiation. How do we bridge the gap? How do we figure out a way to be able to can we create a win-win? Yeah, sometimes we can. But how do we close the gap? And come to an agreement. And then the litigation side. I mean, it's like there's a lot going on there that I think really is going to be able to help people, navigate through, the divorce process. But there's a lot here.
The last thing I would really think that people need to keep in mind when they're in a high conflict relationship or they're potentially starting down that road of divorce, et cetera, is and this is a slightly cynical, but it's not my normal approach is very optimistic, right? But people are like, I want to go forward. I want the judge to do justice, right? Judges don't do justice. And that's not to say that they're not trying, right? They certainly are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But that's their version of what is the right thing. That does not necessarily mean it's your version of what is the right thing, right? The word justice is very squishy, just like fair. Fair is very squishy, right? It depends on who's looking at it. And I get so many parents who come to me and they're like, you know what? Take it to trial because I want justice. I want what I deserve. And I'm like, okay, listen, I will take a case to trial. I have no problem with that. But the second it goes to the judge, I've lost all control. I've lost all control over what time an exchange is. I've lost all control over how many days in the summer you went. Like, I lose control over these fine details that really shape the meat of your custody arrangement.
Yeah.
You really want that, So just keep in mind that judges are there for a reason, and they're wonderful, and we obviously need them, right? But their version of justice may not equal what your version of justice is.
It's interesting because I'm doing a series, solo episodes on the false sense of ... And we did one on false sense of financial security and amicability. Because again, people like to think, oh, it's going to be amicable and we're going to skip through the tulips and everything's going to be great. I'm like, and that keeps you from asking all the right questions. So let's take a more eyes wide open approach. But the one that I have been sitting on that I still need to record is the false sense of justice. And it's primarily because I know that it's a hot topic, and I want to deliver it with grace and awareness and transparency and all the things. And it's not that's not an easy one, because you're right. We need, technically the court system is set up to be able to provide some, decision aspects. Was the family court system ever set up to deal with these high conflict situations? No. Were they set up to, deal with DV in family law? No, they really weren't. It was more of a business transaction. And so it just makes it, people are looking for that justice. They want it to be just. And I'm a person who very much wants justice as well. Like, that's at my core, right?
Exactly.
But we have to identify, like, okay, what exactly is that? And what is the strategy to navigate through that? And really, what does that look like?
Yep. It's all about when people come to me and they have that, I want my justice. I want to just take this to the judge. I pause them and I'm like, okay, well, when you say justice, what does that word mean? Right. And it's probably several things, but you've got to boil it down to, like, what does it actually mean to you? Because that's the only way you're going to be able to move it forward.
Yep.
And it may be that you can get to a settlement because you actually have put this into something that's actually you can get to, right? A lot of times people are like, well, justice is, I want them to be a better person. I'm like, okay, well, even a judge can't give you that, right? Like, even if you got your best day in court, that doesn't, you're not going to, a judge can't make them be a better person, just like a judge can't make them follow a court order, right?
True.
So it's so much of it is just remembering that judges, they need to be there, but their version of justice may not be your version of justice. And also remembering that, like, justice cannot require another person to change.
Right.
That person has to independently want to change.
Yeah. No, this is so true, right? It's like the laws are set up for those of us who are rule followers. That's my conclusion.
100%. Absolutely. I drive on this side of the road. I drive at this speed.
Right? Like, not that we don't push the envelope a little bit, but we're not like,
Listen, if I'm like about to be late for daycare pickup, I will, we want to make sure those cops are not around. Then I am not the rule follower.
Oh my gosh, I totally remember those days. And I'm sure some of our listeners are like, oh, yeah, that's a real thing.
Yes.
Oh, well, this has just been so refreshing. I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know that you have an amazing opt-in, which I actually checked out, and then that was what really prompted me to reach out to you on the co-parenting. So tell us where they can find the co-parenting. I don't know the
Yeah,
official title, planner.
that's okay. Yeah, let's go with it. It's a custody case organizer. But it's on my website, so laurenhuntesq.com. And I think it's under resources. There's a couple of different downloads there, but the custody case organizer is really helpful. It was obviously developed for New York State because that's where I practice, but I think it probably applies in pretty much every state
Yeah.
because to the best of my knowledge, custody everywhere is a best interests analysis. It just may be that the factors are analyzed differently in different jurisdictions. But the idea is that it's supposed to help reduce. It's supposed to kind of pull everything together so that you can take this to your attorney and allow them a succinct overview of your
Yes.
situation.
Love it. I mean, I pulled it. I was like, oh, this is so interesting. And then I was like, this is well organized. This totally, I have not seen anything like it. So kudos to you
Oh,
because
thank you.
it looks really fantastic and made sense, right? Like just as, it just made good sense. So thank you for putting that together.
No problem. What I find is that a lot of people, we use email, right? But email is not the most cost efficient way to communicate.
This is true.
So it is a way to try and reduce the time that somebody would need to transfer their thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, feel free to check that out and at least use it as a framework for thinking through the parenting aspects and organizing all of those pieces. So thank you for that. Well, again, thank you so much for being on my show today. I know that we provided a ton of value for my listeners, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.